Hi, John.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm good. It's good to be with you again.
Good to be with you again. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. You are John Thatamanil. You are a professor at Union Theological Seminary, more specifically, professor of theology and world religions, and you're the author of The Immanent Divine, God, Creation, and the Human Predicament. And you have been with us once before, and we talked about Paul Tillich. This time we're going to talk mainly about Donald Trump. So that's a little bit of a change of channels there. This may be the first time that Tillich and Trump have been mentioned in the same paragraph.
Well, I can make connections if necessary.
Yeah, we'll see what we can do. But, I emailed you some time ago, and I said, I was thinking maybe we could talk about, since you're a theologian, we could talk about Trump from a religious or spiritual perspective, Trump and Trumpism. And what do you think? Can we?
Yeah, I think it can be done, and more importantly, it ought to be done. But your question led me to ponder the meaning of your question, ironically.
It's a job somebody's got to do. I had not done that before sending it.
Well, I thought to myself, now what would it mean to think about Trump or anything political from a distinctively religious or spiritual point of view as opposed to, say, a moral one? So, you could just turn on virtually any form of social media or traditional media and find all manner of moral analyses of Trump's discourse. And I thought to myself, well, what would a religious discourse or a spiritual discourse add to that? Would it just, for example, add an exclamation mark to otherwise moral convictions? So
you could just say, and God agrees with me, after your moral invective.
That's correct. So we could say xenophobia is bad and immoral, and then presumably the religious person would only say that God also thinks that xenophobia is bad and immoral. In which case it poses an interesting question. Does that sort of added exclamation mark matter? And is that all religious reflection adds to it? And if so, does it merely just add a certain kind of dogmatism to convictions we could have gotten to by other means? So all those seem to me to be questions provoked by your invitation to me this afternoon.
Well, let me ask a related question. If the analysis is spiritual or religious, if the analysis is religious, does that mean it does have a moral component?
Yeah, I think it does, but I think it situates that moral component within some broader scheme or vision. So I was pondering, in light of this coming conversation, two statements that I could make. One, for example, that racism is morally odious, and then I thought about what Heschel said in his famous speech on race. He said, well, racism is Satanism. Again, I thought to myself, now that's an exclamation mark for sure, but is there something more? And I think there is something more.
Now, his speech may not be as famous to everyone as it is to you, by the way, but this is Joshua Heschel, a rabbi who wrote a famous book about biblical prophets, for one thing, right?
Yes, he's known for his work on prophecy and, of course, his work on other openness to other religions, but he was also, along with MLK, quite involved in civil rights and most forthrightly spoke about racism as a form of blasphemy, as Satanism, in part because he argued that to demean another in racist ways was to challenge the image of God in every human being. So if God has created human beings in the image of God, then racism is not merely a moral wrong. It's a theological vice. And that extra step, it seems to me, is a matter of situating our moral convictions within some reading of the way things are or ought to be, or how things ought to be because of the way things are. And that larger encompassing framework or vision, I think, is what a religious, spiritual, or theological lens affords us.
Okay, so let's back up and go over that again. So when he first said racism is Satanism, I thought, well, that sounds like what you just said, which is just a moral assertion with an exclamation point, right? And in fact, I just the other day, like yesterday, watched a video that was floating around social media of Alex Jones, this famous conspiracy theorist who has a somewhat symbiotic relationship with Trump. And he was going on and on. He has a huge following. His site is InfoWars or something. He was going on and on about how Hillary is literally demonic. And Obama, he says, I know from people in the Secret Service, they have said that they smell like sulfur. I mean, he was going, you know. So anyway, that he was calling them satanic, and that was a way of saying that his moral judgment against them had the backing of God in a way. But you're saying that this is just the beginning for Heschel, that he has a whole theological articulation having to do with, now it's that to be a racist is to not honor the divine in human beings?
Yes, indeed. So if fundamental affirmation of biblical theology is that the human being is created in the image of God, to do violence to that image is to blaspheme, is to ignore that of the Creator in the created. And that kind of claim situates our moral discourse within a larger worldview, a larger set of sensibilities and orientation. So I think in that sense, there is added something more than the exclamation mark.
Okay.
Although certainly I do think the exclamation mark is
in order.
Yes, and unmistakable. It's surely there. So
yeah, of course. I mean, the Trump defenders would contest the claim that he's racist or that things he said are explicitly racist and so on. There's that.
Yes, but I think it would strain credulity to make that argument, since he dismisses entire groups of people, Mexicans fundamentally as rapists.
He said some of them are good. He said, and I assume some of them are good people. I assume.
Yes.
He didn't state it as a fact. He could not say with complete confidence that one of the millions of Mexicans in the United States is a good person, but he assumed that at least one was.
Right, and then we know by now all the standard dog whistles about law and order. Yeah. His promise to sort of establish, and of course these signals are not being missed by white nationalists and others who recognize him as one of their own. So he knows what he's doing, and he's retweeting anti-Semitic sites, white racist, white power groups. So yes, it's kind of hard to argue that this isn't a discourse awash in racism. So I think for a theologian, for a person who, like Heschel, believes that human beings are created in the image of God, Trumpism is not morally invidious. It is that, surely, but it is also theologically problematic.
Okay. Now, there are theologians who disagree, I assume. I don't know if you... you know what I heard is... this is interesting. Eric Metaxas, is that his name? How does he pronounce his name?
Taxis.
How to pronounce the whole last name?
Metaxas, I believe.
Metaxas.
Yes.
He wrote a biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was briefly at Union Seminary, where you are, many decades ago, and then he was a German who returned to Germany and was ultimately executed for conspiring to assassinate Hitler, and he's famous for that. He was a Christian theologian. And Eric Metaxas wrote a biography of Bonhoeffer. Eric Metaxas is actually, I think, a Trump supporter, is he not? Have you caught wind of this?
Yes, he is, as well as a few other evangelical types. But even there, I think the vast majority are coming around to seeing just how problematic.
Well, the tape that surfaced of Trump's little conversation with this Billy Bush guy has complicated his relationship with some evangelicals.
Right.
Maybe not as many as you might have thought. But have you paid much attention to the discourse of, I don't mean just run-of-the-mill evangelicals, but the kind of, the actual evangelical ministers or theologians who try to frame their support for Trump in religious terms?
I must confess that I haven't carefully studied their positions, in part because, again, it strikes me that anyone who begins his public career as a politician with birtherism just simply doesn't deserve a kind of theological endorsement. Again, that's such an egregious form of racism to call into question the viability of the first black president because he can't possibly be an American. That, the extremes to which one has to go to try to find a moral justification for Trumpism seems so fundamentally at odds with my own sort of religious and theological sensibility that I'm hard-pressed to find a charitable reading of his opponents. I mean, of his defenders, rather.
Interesting that you should use the word charitable, because charity is a word associated with Christianity. Mm-hmm. One might argue that if you're a Christian, you should work as hard as you have to find charity.
Absolutely, as hard as possible.
But this hasn't worked in this case, it sounds like.
Well, I can certainly think well, or try to think well, of the fundamental worth and dignity of the people whose positions I find odious. So yes, there is a sense in which I grieve for Trump. I don't know if you read today's fun piece by David Brooks about it's beautiful. It's a lovely meditation on his captivity to narcissism and how sad and lonely his life must be in light of his just absolute incapacity to actually connect with any other human being. And so, yes, I do think of Trump as a fundamentally wounded human being who is so psychically eviscerated that he has to constantly pump himself up and constantly proclaim his greatness to himself and to the whole nation, and to have mirrored back to him a sense of worth. This is profoundly tragic and sad. And so my act of charity with respect to Trump is to sort of see his pronouncements as indicative of this kind of psychic evisceration. I really feel genuinely sad for him. But that doesn't mean I have to condone what comes out of his mouth as in any way plausible, because I find none of it particularly plausible.
And what about the injunction to actually love your enemy? Is that something a Christian should try to do in this case? Actually feel, I mean, what does that entail, following that injunction in this case?
Well, I think following that injunction is to adopt a posture in which one wishes for the well-being of one's opponent.
Not in the sense of wishing that he wins the election, perhaps. In fact, one finds in Trump, and I think lots of others have said it, a certain kind of self-destructive impulse. As the closer he comes to being a viable political candidate, the more likely he is to spout out something that seems to sabotage himself. So there's a sense in which one wonders whether he truly wants this election to go his way. Of course he does in certain ways, but in certain other ways, I think he knows that he's not equal to the task. So I very much want what he truly wants, which is actually not to win. That's so good of you. That's very Christian of you.
Yes.
Well, I think it's true that there is real evidence that he entered the race with no expectation of winning. It wasn't much he didn't want to win. He just thought, I'm not going to get the nomination, but I can raise my visibility and my brand and so on. That's one theory, at least, and there's some evidence to support that. I've always been skeptical of theories about literally self-destructive impulse. I've always thought that things that are explained that way, like drug addiction, can be explained more parsimoniously in other ways, like drugs feel good, so you keep doing them and you just don't have a lot of self-discipline. And I think that's kind of what it is with Trump. I mean, I don't want to spend too much time on my own theories, but I think the guy is addicted to attention. And what's unusual about him is I don't think it matters as much as it does with some people that the attention be favorable. It's just attention.
I think that certainly is a plausible account.
Yeah. And what about his followers? Now they're different. They are. What is the appropriate Christian attitude toward an analysis of? And not that this is monolithic. Of course, there are different kinds of followers. Some of them would consider themselves deeply religious. I'm sure some wouldn't. But what? How does a Christian, in your view, go about thinking about Trump's followers?
This is a difficult and I think far more painful question. So to begin with, we usually measure the plausibility of candidates by trying to tally up the extent to which one's own convictions and political postures and philosophies and that of the candidate match up. Now, that kind of exercise is hardly possible or even plausible with a candidate who has switched his positions on virtually every issue multiple times. I mean, people have actually counted the literally, I think it's hundreds of times if you add up all his position switches. The egregious number of such vacillations. Now, if somebody's doing that, it's hard to sort of see oneself engaging in a kind of sober-minded political calculus. Well, yes, my views accord with those of Trump. So when it comes to policy positions or general stances about particular questions, about all of which he seems either contentless or oscillating in sort of more or less perpetually. So then one wonders what it is that endears him to a certain group of people, which admittedly is now considerably shrinking, but at one point might have been as many as 40% of voters. Well, if it isn't policy, then what is it? Well, I suspect then we have to sort of think about affect. What is it about him that seems to evoke such sympathetic resonance? And it seems to be that there are a number of things he says that he elicits a kind of sympathetic vibration. Just his key phrases like, "Make America great again," seem to sort of evoke in at least some a kind of, wow, that's great, that's really good. Never mind that doesn't seem to come with any particular set of policy propositions or content. So that's one piece of the analysis. A second piece of the analysis is to sort of look around and see whether some of the plausible theories associated with why he's popular seem to pan out. And one hears, for example, the theory of broad white working class support as a possible reason. Mm-hmm. And of course, I think in the summer we saw from a careful analysis of polling data by Nate Silver in particular, that Trump supporters are several orders of magnitude above the national median for income. So a simple analysis of correlating Trump with the white working class even, or the working class more broadly, simply doesn't work. In fact, Hillary supporters are at or below the national median.
Well, but that would include her African American and Hispanic. I mean, if you looked at her white support, I think she would be well above Trump's demographic in economic terms, right?
That I haven't pinned down yet. I'd love to see data on that. But vis-a-vis his own right-wing opponents in the election, mm-hmm. that isn't the case. So, for example, Ted Cruz supporters Ted Cruz supporters and Rubio supporters were wealthier, but his were significantly wealthy as well. If I recall the statistics correctly, their median income is around 72,000 or so. Mm-hmm. for Trump, and the national median income is around 59,000, I believe. Mm-hmm. So an appeal to straightforward numbers or economic disenfranchisement actually doesn't go far. So that theory seems to be implausible. So then you have this sort of, nativist rhetoric, this this appeal to, of course, birtherism at the very beginning, this boundary building discourse of building the wall and making Mexico pay for it, the law and order discourse, which is always a dog whistle that we're going to keep African Americans in mind. I think I'm hard pressed to find any credible reason other than a kind of profound streak of racism and xenophobia, which has always been part of the American experiment.
Okay, let me throw another variable in. I mean, first of all, if I'm going to be devil's advocate here, so to speak, I guess I'd say that if you ask them about the xenophobia, they would cite two substantive issues. One, they fear terrorism, and that explains their belief, the belief of some of them that maybe all Muslims should be kept out of the country or whatever. And they just argue that that's the surest way to reduce terrorist attacks, leaving aside the merits of that argument, and I don't think there are many, but that would be the claim. And they would say, and my son competes for jobs with Mexican immigrants. In some cases, that is true. That there is in the near term can be a zero-sum game between workers and native-born workers and incoming workers. So they'd say that. I'm not saying that what deserves to be called racism can't begin with those motivations, but I'm saying that I think in defense they would say that. Well, let me just stop there. There's something else I'd say, but
sure, but and I would agree with you. I think there is a sense that I would just only add a slight qualification. I think there are rhetorics about ways of life being imperiled that matter also. Mm-hmm. That as we become more multiracial, multi-religious, that there is a sense of fragility among, I think, in particular, white males, that is being actively cultivated by mm-hmm. Trump's fear-based rhetoric. So he is actually cultivating affects. He wants people to be afraid. He does want to make Americans feel like a kind of an age, a glorious age is behind us. And so we probably have never had a major political candidate who pans the country as it presently exists more routinely than him, right? That America is just, a basket case. Our inner cities are particularly violent, and everything is going to hell in a handbasket. And we used to have a glorious past to which I will return, all of us. So this sense of faded glory, this sense of perpetual threat, of fear, the manufacturing of these affects seems to be an essential part of manufacturing his appeal. Right? And I think these affects are easily then mobilizable mm-hmm. in the direction of xenophobia and racism. And so, yes, I think there's a complicated process that gets us to policy postures that are fundamentally racist and the like.
Of course, politicians always manipulate affect, the successful ones, right? I mean, even the politicians you would call validly inspiring try to cultivate inspiration.
Right.
So that's not what's distinctive or bad here, right? It's the nature of the affect.
Precisely. So one could, this is where one could see Hillary Clinton aspiring to do in her best moments. She tries to speak about stronger together. He goes low, we'll go high. She even spoke about the virtue of love at several points over the summer. But nothing like that has successfully been pursued. I mean, I think she falls back into certain kinds of, policy wonkishness and doesn't realize that she has to cultivate perhaps an equal and opposite set of affects to combat this fear-based rhetoric.
Do you wish she were being, in some sense, more spiritual in her appeal?
Yes, and I think she's perfectly capable of it. She speaks with profound eloquence and conviction about her Methodist roots, and how her commitment to serve the disadvantaged comes from her fundamental commitment to Methodism and Wesleyanism. So she's not only knowledgeable, she's deeply knowledgeable and has a track record of constant connection to the church, Sunday school teaching. She's not someone who has to pretend or manufacture this like Howard Dean had to, and then found that he had to, say that the book of Job was his favorite New Testament book. I mean, that isn't the kind of thing that she needs to do. She has real cred if she were to appeal to it, and she occasionally does.
And unlike Trump, she knows how to pronounce 2 Corinthians.
Yes.
She doesn't call it 2 Corinthians.
That's correct. And so one hears that these notes are occasionally sounded, but they haven't been sounded consistently. I'm not terribly sure that any of Trump's base would be persuaded of, that of the authenticity of her theological and spiritual commitments. But I give them considerable credibility. I think.
I think she has the impulse to go spiritual. I think she feels maybe that she's been burned trying to do it. Very early in the Clinton administration, as First Lady, she adopted a phrase put forth by who's the guy who puts out Tikkun, the journal, Michael Lerner.
Yes.
The politics of meaning was his phrase, and he kind of got into her orbit and used this phrase, and she started using it, and then I think there was some form of embarrassment associated with it, or she decided he was kind of a slightly dicey guy to be a little bit of a loose cannon or something, and so she backed off of that. And I think more broadly, Trump just kind of freaks her out. It's like if you compare the way she looks in the debates within Bernie Sanders debates, she was very agile and combative. And now that's partly a matter of strategy. I think she's decided with Trump, we need a conservative strategy. If I don't screw up, I win. And you can't get in the gutter with him, so avoid certain kinds of arguments. But she just looks like a deer in the headlights sometimes in engaging Trump. And I think to some extent this kind of conservatism of strategy has informed just the way she's dealing with him generally. I don't know.
I'm not going to speculate over much about what the basis for her strategy is. I do think there's something wise in just letting his fulmination speak for themselves. He increasingly looks unhinged, and
although less in the second debate than the first.
Yes, but in the second debate, something else became rather manifest, and that's his sort of stalkery bodily affect and posture. A great number of women are talking about just how triggering watching that debate is. It's not clear that men would pick up on this as keenly and immediately. And
no, in fact, I kind of thought it was working. And I think for certain people it did. Maybe he's playing to his base, and I don't know how that panned out politically, but my wife was like, this is freaky.
Yes, that's correct. And there's a kind of, it was a embodied performance of the rhetoric that we heard on Friday.
Right.
So what he said on the bus, he performed, sort of constantly lurking and looming. So I think in terms of the possibility of any significant change in bringing women on board, he completely lost that after this performance. What he did spoke louder than anything he said.
Now, on the issue of what motivates his supporters, I think there's at least one thing we haven't touched on, which I think is pretty fundamental. I don't think, and again, there are different Trump supporters, and they believe different things and feel different things, but if we do stipulate that for some of them a big issue is Mexicans, for some of them a big issue is Muslims, I think for some of them a big issue is people like me, which is to say, I mean, they take me as like, well, they don't think about me, of course, but if people in my job description, liberals who are journalists or like you, academics, I think they think of as these East Coast cultural elites who hold them in contempt. And I don't feel that way because I didn't grow up on the East Coast. My parents were not East Coast elites. I don't think of myself that way, but I think I think that's a non-trivial part of it. And it's actually something that's been, to some extent, cultivated by like Fox News and others for actually quite some time. So there's a feeling, and here, you know, they might say, you know, I mean, again, the Christianity features quite a bit of sympathy for the downtrodden, you know, blessed are the poor, the last shall be first, and so on. I think they think of themselves, and again, it's not so much an economic matter. You know, most of these people are not in true poverty, but I think they think that the people who run America have forgotten about them, and that we identify more with elites in other countries than we do with Americans who didn't go to great colleges or something, right? And I think that's a really non-trivial part of it, because for one thing, they lump the media in there. This, you know, that's part of the same grievance. Their distrust of the media, I think, is related to this sense. So what do you think of that? And you know, what do you think if they do support Bible verses on their own behalf and depict themselves as among the forgotten?
The set of issues that are looming here are so massive and intertwined that they're hard to fully sort out. On the one hand, I think I hear much of what you have to say. There's certainly a strand of this sort of anti-cultural elitism. But of course, how this cultural elitism can find its antithesis in, you know, a billionaire elite who is himself entirely a part of these circles and has been for quite many decades. It's hard to sort out.
Yeah, but at the same time, we do hold him in contempt. I think they're wrong that we hold them in contempt, but
that's right.
There is a lot of evidence that actually people like you and me do look down at Donald Trump. That's actually something they see as, I think, having in common with him. And the more the establishment rejects him, including now part of the Republican establishment, the more, you know, the more that perception is reinforced.
Right. The other thing that has to be mentioned, of course, is just how freeing he sounds to some. And quite often, among the kinds of freedom that people name, is that he sets them free from political correctness, right? Which is espoused by cultural elites, presumably like you and I. Now, what do we mean by political correctness, or what do they mean by political correctness? Well, I think you and I would say that it's, you know, speaking in ways that accord precisely the marginalized groups that you and I care about in esteem. So we don't speak in ways that demean women. So we are, to be politically correct is to be anti-misogynistic. We don't speak in white supremacist discourse, so we don't say certain kinds of racial epithets. So the kind of freedom that it seems that a great number of Trump supporters purport to want seems to be a freedom from the constraints of these kinds of moral norms, which we think have fundamentally to do with respect. So apparently after this debate, Trump supporters are filling the social media with anti-gay comments against Anderson Cooper. You know, if that's the kind of freedom you want, that's not a kind of freedom I wish to celebrate. And so there's a lot of dicey things going on here. under the name of anti-elitism. Now, I wish we could say that what we were seeing here was a fundamental manifestation of a kind of working class anger at the way in which both Democratic Party and the Republican Party have bought into a neoliberal economic frame that leaves working classes behind. That would be a kind of anti-elitism, which would be a kind of anti-elitism of the 1%, which I would be deeply sympathetic to.
I think there is some of that, don't you?
Precious little, because then again, you wouldn't go to find your champion in somebody who incarnates the very virtues of robber capitalism. I mean, Trump makes no real product or profit. He takes over companies, runs them into the ground, finds ways to use bankruptcy laws to extract funds from companies that he takes over, and then the rest of his operation is scamming. I mean, Trump University and branding. So there's actually very little positive economic output generated by any of his companies, and so he seems to embody the very worst of the kind of capitalism that we now have. You know, it's not manufacturing capitalism. He hasn't actually created a factory where people are getting, a good paycheck and are able to sort of work themselves up from poverty into a stable middle class position. That isn't the kind of capitalism that he can be the public face of. So I find these sort of working class populist elements, certainly present in Bernie Sanders supporters, but I see precious little of that in Trump supporters. And certainly they can't look at him and say, well, he'll be the person who does this for us, because his entire track record is fundamentally the very opposite of such aspirations.
Yeah, although once you think you've found your leader, somebody speaking your language like nobody else is, and there's the real prospect of that person coming into power and serving your interests, I think people are pretty good at convincing, at forgiving a lot and explaining away a lot. And
is that language? That's what I'm trying to sort of, elicit here. A recent Atlantic Monthly piece called him the most ostentatiously unqualified candidate in the history of American politics, or something to that effect.
Mm-hmm.
The absolute lack of demonstrated qualifications for this job probably has never been,
right,
set to the bar. So,
but I think the sense of disenchantment with the ruling class, including all current politicians, is so profound that people are just like, no, the people who actually have the resumes have not gotten the job done. And, this is a kind of reaction that people have, to things. And they have them on the left and on the right in times of ferment and revolution,
Yes, but then one has to sort of, my argument is, in the face of no demonstrable set of qualities or knowledge base or past history, you've got to find out what the appeals actually are. Mm-hmm. And so far as I can tell, there are no appeals other than what he routinely speaks about, which is xenophobia, building the wall and getting Mexico to pay for it, speaking against immigrants, the alien, the stranger in our midst. So in terms of theological virtues, he's the very antithesis of the kinds of core values that we associate with the bedrock of the Christian tradition: the widow, the orphan, the stranger in our midst. That's not the
the explicitly multinational, you might say, emphasis that goes back to the very beginning, right? I mean, the famous verse from Paul, neither Jew nor Greek, and so on. I mean, that Christianity took shape in a cosmopolitan milieu. So I'll accept that that's you can defend that as a Christian value. At the same time, I think people very rarely think of themselves as bad people, and I do think most Americans will say that racism is bad, and that misogyny, although that's a much more rarely used word than racism, they'll say they don't hate women as a class. And, you know, and so to get back to the political correctness issue, I think, and I also don't think we should over extrapolate from like the most disgusting people on Twitter, whatever they're saying right now. But I suspect that most Trump supporters do not use the N-word, and they would say, you know, and what they would say is, you know, about, to get back to the political correctness thing, is they would point out, look, the rules have gotten a lot tighter than that. It's no longer just don't say the N-word, right? It's like a whole host of things you have to tiptoe around. And sometimes, you know, honestly, they like, you know, when I have to stop and think, you know, I've said this before on this show, but when I was denouncing Trump for mocking and I said a handicapped person, and then I had to stop and think, wait, is handicap still the acceptable term? You know, there is a lot of that you have to do, and a certain amount of mental energy has to go into it. So when these people perceive that the people who are imposing this speech code on them, some of which they think is gratuitous, are the enemy to begin with, they are these elites who don't like them, you know, I think it all kind of interrelates this way. And even the term white supremacist, which you use, now white supremacist used to mean, you know, something different. It meant people who said explicitly, whites are better, deserve better, and on and on and on. And the fact is, the term white supremacist is now used much more broadly than that. It's used to denounce people who never say things like that.
Yeah, and in the end, I'm not fundamentally concerned about speech codes myself. I'm concerned about systematic racism. I'm concerned about economic policies that, you know, disenfranchise some and enfranchise others. You know, just
right. But when they talk about political correctness, I think they largely mean speech codes, and they would point out that the speech codes are changing, and have changed, and they feel more constrained by them.
And when I'm talking about racism, I'm not just talking about the N-word. I'm talking about somebody who wants to bring back stop and frisk, regardless of the fact that it's it's been ruled unconstitutional. So
right, but even there, they would say, see, they don't think of themselves. I'm just saying they don't think of themselves as racist for favoring stop and frisk.
Yes, and I don't care that they don't think of themselves.
Right, but I'm just trying to. My whole job here apparently has become trying to present the way I think the world looks from their point of view, which I think is isn't that a very Christian thing?
It is, and I do think that imagining ourselves in as credible and sympathetic a reading of those whom we oppose is a fundamental task. But and that's why I would talk about not how they see themselves, but the ways in which I think persons are vulnerable to manipulation. So I do think that if you sort of make people feel vulnerable, under threat, and you inundate them with a discourse that is calcifying, that is generating insensitivity in them. I'm talking about Fox News, the sort of right-wing talk show industry. These people have been mocking and huge chunks of American populace. They are profoundly soaked in the washed in misogyny. I mean, the sort of comments about Megyn Kelly and blood coming out of who knows where. This kind of discourse is totally normal in what a great section of the country is listening to.
Well, it's become that way. I mean, he has normalized a lot of stuff that wasn't normal.
Well, actually, I think that he's brought it to a certain.
I mean, it wasn't normal in these media venues. I wasn't hearing it.
That's correct. But I do think that if you turn on any particular episode of Rush Limbaugh, you'd hear a good bit of
some. Yeah, that's true.
So this is not new. It's merely coming out of the closet and giving itself great public visibility. And right-wing movements do seem to emerge in moments where people feel a certain kind of cultural onslaught. There is, in fact, a case to be made that, economic factors do play a role in this, that incomes have been stagnant for decades now, and there is a cultural sense of cultural and economic sense of fragility. All of that is abroad, but I think those fundamental economic factors, those larger cultural and even ecological issues which imperil us all, the real fears that we ought to be talking about, are not the ones we're talking about. Right? So instead, our sense that something fundamentally is in fact awry, and believe me, there's plenty really awry. I mean, the fact that we're living in ecocidal peril is in fact a real and genuine apocalyptic fear that ought to be concerning us. But instead, we are being taught to fear certain groups and classes of people, and that, it seems to me, is morally problematic and spiritually toxic. And the generation of, as I said, fear and anger, rather than the cultivation of sensibilities like empathy or love, that's what concerns me. And for a Christian theologian, a discourse of fear rather than faith is inimical to the heart of the tradition, right? Perfect love casts out fear. We're called to cultivate in ourselves a different set of moral dispositions, not these. And that's what I'm concerned about.
Yeah, and I think a couple of things. I think one thing you suggested, I think, is true, is that the way for this has been paved to some extent for many years by things like Fox News, and it gets back to the fact that there are actual issues, economic issues, in the heartland that Republicans have systematically not addressed, and that's posed them with a political problem, which is how do you keep these people on board whose economic needs you're not particularly serving, and they've given them instead, to some extent, the social issues. We agree with you on abortion or gay rights or whatever, but also they've cultivated antipathy toward these supposed cultural elites. It's like a let them eat hate kind of strategy, and I think, and see, that's why, in the end, the people, I don't think that's all that's going on by any means. I think it's one thing that's going on. And the people that I find most reprehensible, the thing I find most reprehensible about Trump is that I don't know that he's a racist or anything else. What I feel sure of is that he so wants attention that he would do anything to get it, including appeal to the worst parts of human nature. And that's the dangerous thing about him. If he had racism would at least be a conviction. He'd have a principle. It wouldn't be a good one. But in a way, I think the most dangerous kind of person is a person like him who will appeal to any part of human nature in order to aggrandize his own stature, power, and just hang on to attention. So I guess that's a little bit of a sermon, but
and it also names something that a phrase that I found completely helpful to me in a variety of contexts, which I think is Stanley Tambia, the Harvard anthropologist, phrase: majority with a minority complex. Right? Make people who are in fact numerically the majority feel like they are in fact somehow the minority, and make them feel aggrieved against actual minorities and persons who are in fact structurally vulnerable. So the anti-homophobic comments, the anti-immigrant comments, right? These are dedicated and directed at actual minorities whose positions are marked by precarity. And instead, we generate another set of sentiments in which white majorities are made to feel like they are the aggrieved and wounded. When that discourse is set in motion, then that population can be mobilized in directions that are, in fact, actually self-harming. So, and this, of course, was precisely the kind of thing that the King's Poor People campaign was meant to avert, right? To bring and create a sort of multiracial poor people's campaign in order to address fundamental structural inequities that bear upon white working class voters, which are in fact in raw numbers far greater than the African American poor, right? In terms of just sheer raw numbers, right? So there's a sense in which there's an affect machine that has been at work over now decades on the right wing to generate this sort of majority with a minority complex. And those affects have very little to do with the fundamental orientations that Christians are supposed to cultivate in themselves. And that's the theological problem. What are we being taught to hate? What are we being taught to love? I think if we ask those questions, we get pretty close to theological very fast. Are we being taught to love the other, the neighbor, the one who doesn't look like me, the one who doesn't think like me? Or am I being taught to be suspicious of and hate and close the door to the other? That's a set of theological questions.
Okay. Well, is there anything else you want to say from a theological perspective about Trumpism or?
Well, that piece I sent you talks a bit about vulnerability and invulnerability.
Right. Now, this is a piece you wrote about a year, when Pope Francis was visiting.
Right.
And you contrasted Pope Francis with Donald Trump, which is not an intrinsically difficult contrast to draw, I must say. But you got a little more fine-grained than that. You did. A big issue was vulnerability versus Trump was like. You explain it.
Yeah. No. I was puzzled by the fact that these two people were claiming such public oxygen at the same time. Admittedly, likely not by the same people, but there was something about the striking contrast between the two and the striking draw that both had that was puzzling me. And I was just trying to think this through. What is going on? And I fundamentally think that it has to do with two conceptions of power. Power as vulnerability, and power as invulnerability. And Trump is obviously on the side of the latter, that our true power comes from rendering ourselves invulnerable from every possible perceived threat. And then, of course, we manufacture some of these threats, or racialize them, or religionize them. And so the Muslim, the other, the racial other, and so forth, and the Mexican other, and we build walls. So the wall becomes a kind of symbol for the kind of power of the invulnerable. And then there's another kind of power, the kind of power we might call relational power, the power of vulnerability, the power that recognizes that we are all of us in it together. And that to secure our well-being at the expense of another is actually a misguided notion of what power constitutes in a world that is, as King would say, woven together an inescapable network of mutuality, a single garment of destiny. Right? If life is marked by our belonging to each other, then the only kind of authentic power that conforms to a world that's marked by deep relationality is sort of opening up into that vulnerability. Now, this doesn't mean we render ourselves and put ourselves in situations of precarity where we add sort of vulnerability on top of vulnerability, right? So we certainly are not, I'm not talking about adding poverty onto the fact that we're already vulnerable, because just simply because we're mortal, finite, threatened by weather and any number of things, right? So yes, there are certain kinds of precarious situations we seek to avoid, but realizing that we're sort of just bound to be vulnerable by the fact that we just fragile human creatures who belong to each other and need each other, that is another kind of power that we ought to be seeking, right? The power of our co-belonging and nurturing in us a capacity to recognize that I can't actually be well and whole and hale in an economic system that marginalizes you. And I see Francis as a kind of embodiment of this wisdom of our co-belonging, and including, of course, to the planet Earth. The one issue that's being mentioned not a whit by either party, ironically, is the greatest threat that we all actually face: planetary peril through climate change. So, of which he has become an ardent supporter. So, I wish we could talk theologically and spiritually about opening into our belonging with each other, and the virtue that would have to meet that sort of belonging with each other are virtues like love and compassion.
So you're equating the acknowledgement of vulnerability with the recognition of practical interdependence.
That's correct.
We have to work together. We have to, I can't lose. I can't win if you lose, and so on.
That's right.
I mean, because if you are, I think it goes well beyond climate. The forms of interdependence. I mean, I think if millions of Muslims in the Middle East feel alienated and hated and feel that the U.S. is at war with them, that's bad for us, and so on. I mean, I think there are a lot of forms of interdependence, and that they've grown through history, and so I see what you're saying now about vulnerability. I mean, Trump, of course, is addressing. He's in some sense addressing people's vulnerability. You would say he's taking advantage of their sense of vulnerability
and magnifying.
Yeah, and giving them the illusion of invulnerability, giving them the illusion that they are not interdependent.
That's correct.
Yeah,
that they can actually secure their well-being by cutting themselves off from others in need.
Right.
And that's a theological and metaphysical lie. That's just not the kind of world we inhabit. And to sort of, this is where I think it's insufficient to make moral claims. It's important to add something more than an exclamation mark by saying we just don't live in that world. We live in a world in which we are bound to each other. And the Christian theologian says that's the world that God has created. God has created us in a world of interdependence, where the well-being of one depends on the well-being of all. And so to sort of act against that world is to act against the very structures of creation.
So would you say if we agree that history has actually featured a growth in interdependence, I mean, certainly relative to like 3,000 years ago when people around the world didn't even know about each other, that is an expression of divine will or an expression of divinity, the growth in interdependence with the moral entailments it has, right? I mean, responding wisely to interdependence involves a kind of moral growth, right?
No, it's astonishing, of course, that the persons to whom we look to guide us in terms of cultivating the appropriate sentiments in an interconnected world are people who lived over 2,000 or 2,500 years ago. So apparently this wasn't news to the Buddha or to Jesus. So whether we're in any sort of state of moral advancement over those who intuited the nature of reality before we got there is hardly demonstrable to me. What you seem to be saying is what Siddhartha Gautama and Jesus intuited has become sort of manifest historically in terms of a set of social, technological infrastructures,
right,
that make it sort of,
which were arguably pretty close to inexorable. If you look at the history of technological level, if you accept that communication and transportation technology were going to advance, people were bound to grow more interdependent. I'm asking you if it's theologically plausible from your point of view that that's an expression of divinity, the fact that that is has been the direction of history.
Yes. I'm prepared to say that. I could get there by any number of different theological and metaphysical schemes. But yes, I would be I would say yes to your statement. But in light of our sort of particular conversations around Trump, I think, and Francis, it seems to me that we have a choice. We have a fairly stark choice between sort of living into the truth of our admittedly occasionally scary vulnerability with blinders off, or denying it and saying, I will work for my own well-being and the well-being of those who look like me. And we are being presented by that stark choice in Trump. I do not think of Hillary as the antithesis, by the way. I mean, as a sort of hawkish neoliberal, I don't think of her as a kind of quality. I mean, I think she's not a pathologically unbalanced person, as I actually happen to think Trump is. So I'm not going to sort of generate any false equivalence here, but she isn't yet advocating the kind of vision I would like her to more robustly advocate. Still, she comes far closer to speaking the truth of our being stronger together, to use one of her sort of platform statements, than Trump does. So there is a kind of clear sense that if we're going to be spiritually and theologically attuned to the nature of our co-belonging, there's a pretty clear choice, a pretty obvious one.
Okay, well, we will leave it there. So we've now had a conversation about Tillich, a conversation about Trump, and we will see months down the road if there's anybody else who probably would lie somewhere between those two poles, I would think, in some sense, but anybody else to have a conversation about.
Well, we haven't even gotten to all the stuff that we could have talked about the relationship between love, power, and justice, which are fundamental themes in Tillich that we could have talked about today, where power has to be corrected by and ordered towards the norms of love and justice. But anyway, that's another.
Well, some of that was a little bit implicit, I would say.
Yes,
but,
yes, I think so.
But okay, then that's the next one, and we'll wait and see whose administration we're doing it during. Okay, well, thanks again, John. Really appreciate it. That was very good.
Thanks.
Take care.